Now back to Nigeria, ProShares hosted a webinar discussing Nigeria's path to $1 trillion economy. While the capital market has grown over the last 2 decades, it still lacks the long-term resources to fuel rapid infrastructure growth and provide efficient funding to reach a $1 trillion economy by 2030. Major reforms in the capital market are essential. ProShare economists emphasize that the rebasing highlights our progress, but the government must shift from promises to strategic policy action and execution. Let's take some excerpts.
Rebasing is something that ought to have been done every 5 years. The last time we had it, particularly for GDP, was in 2014, as you rightly noted. So 10 years down the line, there is need to have to rebase our GDP, particularly so when you have increase in the data economy, knowledge economy, digital economy. You're witnessing a number of new products. You're witnessing a number of. You're also witnessing changes in consumption patterns. And again, perhaps more importantly too, you want to also maintain international comparability. That's why you also need to rebase. And when we rebased in 2014, remember the base year was 2010. The GDP went from below $400 billion to over $500 billion, and Nigeria emerged at that time as the biggest economy in Africa. Now, 10 years after, what have we seen? We have dropped from that first position to fourth position, to the point where the GDP number now is, even just as you mentioned, or Tosi mentioned in the presentation, although the one Tosi mentioned was about $100 and something billion using ProShare data, but some other data talks about $362 billion. So, but what is important as GDP has dropped in dollar terms. So, what is the major lesson? Or what are the major lessons? For me, it is to recognize the fact that it's not just about the number, GDP number. So, when you have grown your GDP, we expect that this rebasing will also result in a larger, GDP number, as even suggested by Tosin in the report that we are likely to have by the ProShare estimation over $400 billion economy. But I also think that by the time the MBS is done with what they're doing using their own methodology, we may have something even a lot much higher, such that the gap between the GDP and the 1 trillion naira becomes quite narrower. So the major lesson for me is the fact that we have to put an eye on exchange rate.
Two of the major indicators that you watch is the GDP and inflation. And like Prof mentioned, in 2014, when the GDP was rebased, we saw that there was a sharp increase in the value of GDP. We are going to see the same thing play out this time around, but a major concern is that the increase might not be as much as we saw in 2014 because of the exchange rate impact. And what that means is that there's another devaluation in the value of the exchange rate. The naira and the GDP size will also shrink again. Then, if you also look at it, it is a necessary. I think the rebasing is necessary at this point in time because ideally, a country is meant to rebase its GDP and CPI every 5 years. And if you look at it, last time the GDP was rebased, that was in 2014. That's like a decade ago. So it is long overdue. Same thing with inflation. Inflation too is long overdue. So it's a necessary step, and it's that is taken, and it is very necessary and required at this point in time. But at the same time, I would like to say that in as much as we're trying to make sure that these two indicators reflect the current economic realities, the process to which we are doing this is very important. Looking at the activities that will be added to the GDP, look at the digital activities, look at modular refineries. They are actually good because since the COVID-19 pandemic, there has been a disruption or sort of some structural shift in the Nigerian economy, and this has to be reflected in the size of our GDP. But a major concern for me is the illegal activities that will be added to the GDP size, because that is going to actually overstate the true picture of what the size is. It's not about the number, it's about the reflection of what the size of the economy is. And because you know that economic indicators in themselves, they are not they are not enough, but they are like an input that is being used by policymakers to actually come up with policy. So if you have an overrated or overestimated GDP, it's going to affect the decisions that will be taken by these two bodies, both the monetary authorities and the fiscal authorities. But what I think is, if we can actually streamline the process to adding activities that are important and that are legitimate to the GDP size, it's going to give us a true picture of what the size is and not overestimate what the size is, because this is actually critical, as the size of the GDP will influence any decision that will be taken. Then as regards the CPI, we've also known that since the COVID-19 pandemic, there has been a shift in consumers' consumption pattern. We've seen, because of the work from home, the hybrid mode of work and others. So we have seen increased use of data, and also it's important that this kind of activity attract a larger weight in the CPI basket. So it is important at this point in time. It's just that the process has to be such that it is not overstated. It truly reflects what the true picture of the Nigerian economy is.
How will the rebasing the GDP and, of course, the CPI influence the current narrative and understanding of Nigeria's economic structure as it is now?
In summary, Nigeria can be referred to as a monoculture economy. Monoculture in terms of its revenue generation and also in terms of sectors that drive the economy. So let me break it down. So Nigeria has historically been a country that relies on one sector to generate its effects. So look at it, when it was in the past, in the 90s, it was agriculture, then we moved to the discovery of oil, and since then it has always been oil that we've been depending on. So this, we have seen also when we look at it in terms of sectors. So recently we've seen that it's only the service sectors that's actually driving the growth that we're seeing in the economy. So this structure has actually opened it up to some vulnerabilities that has been susceptible to so many shocks in the global scene. So it has actually affected our indicators. So look at the inflation. Inflation has gone up significantly. We have, look at our FX position. So we have FX deficit. We don't have sufficient, and as reviewed in terms of our exchange rate, has depreciated significantly after the devaluation that was done in 2023. So all these factors just gives us a breakdown of how the Nigerian structure is. Then look at it, because we have shortage of revenue, we've relied so much on debt. And because we rely so much on debt, we have been giving us debt sustainability concerns, increase our exposure, and also how we can raise funds. So all these things had a structure. So what would rebasing do there? So rebasing, let me define it in my own terms, is just a computation necessity. It is being done every 5 years, as stated by the previous speakers. So when it's being done, what happens? So going back in 2014 when it was done, we saw that inflation moderated, GDP went up. Those are positive, but subsequent years after that, we saw that a reversal will happen. So that speaks that the structural problems are not being addressed. So yes, GDP increasing, we have inflation moderating, can signal to investors positively, but it doesn't address the underlying problem. So, and also I wanted to mention earlier that Nigeria has a very large informal sectors. So this rebasing actually allows us to capture more. So we see a shrink in the informal sectors. It's positive. However, there's still some structural problems that need to be addressed. So I want to talk again about the elephant in the room, which is actually the household. So policies, we have plans, projects, always have a trickle-down effect on households. So what does the rebasing mean to household? It necessarily doesn't affect the household, because the prices they are getting in the market is still elevated. It is just, what the rebasing does is just trying to help us see the current realities using a new base year. And it's good because it captures more. It helps us in terms of the food basket, so you have to capture more. In terms of items, because it has been increased from 700 and something to 900. It's based on the numbers, which is good. It reflects the number, the variety of foods are being consumed, and also the prices. But the structural problems of the country still persist, and it might not necessarily influence it. If the right policies are not being implemented, it is just a temporary evaluation of the Nigerian economy.
What does GDP represent? It represents the total output of an economy within a specific period, usually considered to be a year. That's what GDP is. How much have we produced as a country? And what rebasing really states is that okay, let's be sure of the value of the total quantity of goods and services produced in that economy. So, like Ade had pointed out, it's really just a number, right? So it doesn't necessarily translate into improvements in the real sector of the economy. It just gives us an idea of how big or how small that sector is. And then Professor Wadeke made a very fundamental remark when he said, when you're looking at GDP, you're looking at, when we look at nominal GDP, we're looking at price and we're looking at quantity. Now, the report of ProShare emphasizes the price. You saw inflation adjustments going up. Currently, inflation is at 34.6%. So we've also seen quantity. But that quantity wasn't captured properly because of the wrong base. Or let me say, don't let me say the wrong base, but the fact that we haven't consistently adjusted those bases after every 5 years. So we've stalled a bit on that. But Prof's argument on foreign exchange is critical. And it's one of the important points we emphasize in our report, actually. We believe that foreign exchange is responsible for between 60 and 65% of domestic inflation. And that's why when Tosin was talking, he showed that chart that no matter how much we move the monetary policy rate, it's not likely to move the needle of inflation. Domestic inflation won't likely move. What we need to do, basically, is to see how we can increase foreign reserves, which is what Prof was actually referring to.
Foreign reserve adequacy.
So, foreign reserve is inadequate. That foreign reserve scarcity translates into the high level of domestic prices we currently see. And so I agree, Prof, there totally. There is a need to address the foreign reserve question.